On June 30, 1908, a catastrophic event occurred which, despite being the largest of its kind in recorded history, remains largely unnoticed. An event so catastrophic that it could have killed millions of people and wiped many large modern-day cities off the map in mere seconds. Except this event occurred deep within the remote Siberian taiga. This event is known as the Tunguska Event. At around 7:17 in the morning of June 30, 1908, Evenki natives observed an extremely bright bluish-white object moving slowly downward toward the horizon. The object was nearly impossible to look at, glowing brighter than the sun. It appeared to have a cylindrical shape and left a thin white trail in its path. As it neared the ground, the object seemed to smudge. Suddenly, there was a bright flash, and a huge column of black smoke rose into the air, emitting flames of uncertain shapes. People near the event watched as the entire landscape around them turned red, and the air became so hot that it felt as if their clothes were on fire. The sound of an incredibly strong wind was heard. Immediately following came a tremendous shockwave, destroying structures, shattering glass, and throwing people backward, some up to 40 meters. Ringing in the air was a sound akin to that of artillery fire. Trees snapped like toothpicks, and the entire forest was uprooted and flattened to the ground, bursting into flames. Then came a second shockwave as strong as the first, and then a third. The shockwaves were felt hundreds of kilometers away, and many people were knocked unconscious, some for just a few minutes, and others for 3 days. The peaceful morning had just been interrupted by one of the most extreme events in recorded history. Quantifying the number of injuries and casualties from this event is difficult. More on that in a bit. However, the Tunguska event caused at least 3 deaths and an unknown number of injuries, with many people lying unconscious for hours or even days. The blast flattened around 2,150 square kilometers of forest, an estimated 80 million trees. This photograph was taken nearly 21 years after the event, yet the forest has barely begun to recover. The shockwaves were powerful enough to knock people off their feet 600 kilometers from the epicenter and knock people unconscious nearly 200 kilometers away. For several nights after the event, the skies glowed all the way to Northern Ireland, bright enough to read a newspaper by after midnight. The glow was likely caused by particles dispersed in the upper atmosphere. It's actually not very easy to determine what happened or even how exactly the story goes. The description given just now was a compilation of data collected from interviews with many different witnesses, and is the most likely storyline. But there are many inconsistencies and problems with the data. The people who were interviewed lived deep within remote forest. Their language didn't even have a written form before 1931, and they had many superstitions. These superstitions led them to avoid talking about dead relatives or friends, which made it difficult for interviewers to assess the casualties from this event. These superstitions may also have embellished some of the stories as well. It's really hard to know. And of course, many of these interviews were recorded decades after the event occurred. In fact, not until nearly 20 years later in 1927 was the first scientific expedition to the blast site. Some of the stories were from people who were children at the time of the event, some of the stories were from people hearing what someone else told them, and the list of likely possibilities of how stories were exaggerated or completely distorted just goes on and on. So it goes without saying that what we think we know may not be factual at all. However, there is some data that is simply undeniable. The place of the event is still visibly scarred to this day, which absolutely verifies that this was an extreme event. Otherwise, the forest would have easily regrown in the nearly 120 years since the event. However, there is almost no evidence of any sort of explosive or meteor at the blast site. This has led to 2 main theories for the event. One theory is that a small comet, composed of things like dust and ice, vaporized in Earth's atmosphere, thus leaving no traces at the blast site. This theory is further supported by the glowing skies after the event, as the dust and ice from the meteor could have been dispersed in the upper atmosphere. This theory is then even further supported as the time of the event was at peak activity of the Beta Taurids meteor shower, suggesting that a fragment of Comet Encke was responsible for the event. However, this theory begins to break when some other data comes into the picture. The other and more likely theory is that an asteroid composed of iron entered Earth's atmosphere, traveling at an insane 27 kilometers per second, or Mach 80. The asteroid then exploded mid-air about 9 kilometers above the ground. Its size has been estimated at around 60 meters in diameter. Whereas a comet would have likely disintegrated in the upper atmosphere, an iron meteor would have been able to make it into the lower atmosphere, which would be required for the tree fall pattern. This theory is also supported by materials found in the trees near the blast site, which are found in rocky asteroids, but not comets. Various other analyses have also supported the asteroid theory, although there is really not enough evidence for either the comet or the asteroid theory to definitively prove one as the correct theory. In early 2013, an event similar to the Tunguska event occurred over Chelyabinsk. This event is the second largest meteor event in recorded history. It was much smaller than the Tunguska event, but importantly, a lot more data was able to be collected than from the Tunguska event. This allowed scientists to compare the aftermath of the Tunguska event to a similar meteor event. It also provided recordings of what the so-called artillery fire after the main blast sounded like. It sounds exactly like artillery fire. The Chelyabinsk Meteor released the equivalent of around 450 kilotons of TNT and exploded about 30 kilometers above the ground. With that energy and distance, there was enough power from the shockwaves to collapse brick walls and shatter glass 100 kilometers away. The Chelyabinsk Meteor was smaller, traveled slower, and exploded at a much higher altitude than the Tunguska Meteor. If an event with just 4% the blast energy and 3 times the altitude of the Tunguska event produces results like this, it makes one wonder what the result would have been if the Tunguska event had happened over a populous city instead of remote forest. It also makes one very grateful that our planet was designed with an atmosphere to catch most of the meteors before they become a real hazard. The Tunguska event is, to this day, the largest impact event on Earth in recorded history.